I'm half Chinese and half white, so that means that Chinese people think I'm white, and white people think I'm Mexican. I want to tell you about my grandpa Joe Bahinsky. Spoiler alert, that's the white side of my family. My grandpa Joe lived through the Great Depression, which gave America a generation of people that were really into telling you how much their childhood sucked. But when I was 11, my dad died, and my grandfather, who was a retired baker and recent widower, moved from Chicago to North Carolina to help out. And I had just moved to the South, too. And I stuck out in my school because I was the only Asian kid, and I had a Massachusetts accent, and I could read at grade level. But because we were both outsiders with no friends, Grandpa and me were best buddies. And I'd spend all my weekends at his house, and he'd give me projects like building birdhouses out of used bleach bottles, or rendering lard from fatback, or organizing his vast collection of aluminum ashtrays he stole from Burger King. It was like summer camp, if you went to a camp themed around the Depression. But as he got older, my grandfather wasn't doing that great. Had a lot of chronic health problems like diabetes, which is an occupational hazard when you spend 40 years of your life as a baker and you weigh over 300 pounds. And I was driving down to visit him when my mom told me he was in the ambulance. I'd slept in that morning, so I could have been there, but instead I arrived 45 minutes after he was pronounced dead. And I felt so guilty I wasn't there. And I told my mom I wanted to plan the funeral. And she could see I was devastated, so she agreed. And I'd never planned a funeral before, but I figured I'd just do something conventional. Crying people, flowers, pallbearers at a burial service. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? But then my mom came back to me, and she said that she'd thought it over, and she decided she wanted to plan the funeral. And I wasn't sure if that was such a good idea. See, first, my mom was emotionally compromised. I mean, she was acting like this was all happening to somebody else. But more importantly, even under normal circumstances, my mother is hyper-efficient and very unsentimental. Every year for Christmas, she cuts me a check to buy my own Christmas presents, which I then have to wrap and put under her Christmas tree so that on Christmas Eve, I can unwrap them in front of her so she gets to be surprised by what she bought me. So I'm conflicted. You know, I mean, she just lost her dad. I mean, how can I say no? But what kind of funeral is my grandfather gonna get from a woman who makes me go to IHOP 15 minutes early so she doesn't have to wait for a table? But in the end, I decide, you know, he was your dad, okay? I figured, what was the worst that could happen? The first sign of what I should expect was when my mom told me to buy bereavement airplane tickets to Chicago for her, my brother, and me, leaving on Friday and returning on Saturday afternoon. And I said, when's the funeral? And she said, Saturday at noon. And I said, but our flight back's at 3. And she said, I know, we'll have to make it quick. So we land in Chicago, and I asked her how we're getting to the cemetery. And she hadn't thought about that, so we had to hail a cab. And when the cab driver got us to the funeral home inside the cemetery, he said, that'll be $30. And Mom, without missing a beat, said, stay here, we'll be right back. So we go inside and we meet the funeral director, and he's this real young guy. And he looked nervous, and I think it was because he wasn't sure if we understood what was actually going to happen. So he says, well, as I told your mom on the phone, I guess we're just gonna bring your grandfather in here and open the casket, and then we'll just take him away for internment. I mean, that was supposed to be it. That's the entire funeral. So he leaves, and these two guys in white jumpsuits wheel my grandfather in on a steel gurney. And as soon as I saw the casket, it was apparent that whatever attempt had been made to upsell my mother a nicer casket had been unsuccessful. We had gone off the shelf, and so the casket was not custom built. And as I mentioned before, my grandfather was a gentleman of large carriage. So when they opened up the lid, it looked like he was bursting out of the coffin. Not unlike a rising loaf of bread, which is a fitting end for a baker. So we stand there for a few minutes, kind of soaking in this spectacle, when I notice the funeral director has re-entered the room, and he's looking at us like we're the saddest thing he's ever seen, which is saying a lot for a man in his line of work. It's obvious he feels bad, and he says to us as if he wants to make it better, "Would you like to see us intern the body?" And we're like, we have a plane to catch? But he's like, no, we're ready to do it now. It'll be really quick. And he said, "I'll go pull around the hearse." And I'm thinking, a hearse? Finally, this is gonna start feeling like a real funeral. Yes, we want this. And so he says, "Okay, so when I pull the hearse around, what kind of car are you driving?" And I'm like, actually, we have a cab waiting outside. And his face makes an expression like, "That makes it sadder." So we go back out to the cab, and the cab driver has no idea what's going on. He has no clue. We've only been gone for 10 minutes. But the hearse pulls around, and we follow it to the back of the funeral home, and then it stops. And then this huge garage door opens up, and this gigantic flatbed truck emerges carrying a 5-foot-tall cement block and a big yellow crane on the back. No, I didn't know this, but when people die, they put the coffin inside of a concrete vault. Most people spend lots of money, so you never have to see any of that. But my grandfather, who's been stuffed into an itty-bitty coffin, is now ensconced in 3 tons of cement on the back of a flatbed truck, followed by a hearse and a yellow cab. And the cab driver, for the first time realizing that he's a part of the world's shittiest funeral procession, has the wits about him to turn on his headlights. So we get to the plot, and the 2 guys in white jumpsuits, now wearing yellow hard hats, get out and start working the noisy crane. And they get my grandfather's coffin positioned halfway into his grave, like a prize in an industrial toy claw machine. When the funeral director motions for them to stop, and he turns around and he looks at us and he says, "Would anyone like to say anything?" And it's my grandfather, the man who taught me how to shave, is hanging there like some kind of obscene death piñata. I'm at a loss for words. So the funeral director looks back at the 2 guys and he goes, and they pull a lever, the concrete block hits the ground with a thud, and the funeral director, as if we've just buried a goldfish, says, "So, that's it." So we get back in the cab, and Mom just loses it. She starts sobbing. It's the most emotion she's shown since he died. And I'm sitting up front with the cab driver as we go to the airport, and for the first time, I look over at the cab driver, and he has this pained expression on his face, like he's experiencing this existential crisis, and he's coming to the sudden realization he really needs to call his children. So, the ride to the airport, It's like this awkward, tense, long silence. And finally, out of nowhere, the cab driver blurts out, "That was the most beautiful funeral I have ever seen." But you know what? He was right. That is exactly the funeral my grandfather would have wanted, because we saved so much money and we made it home in time for dinner. Mostly, though, I think my grandfather would have been happy that the people that cared about him the most got to say goodbye. I hope I should be so lucky. Thank you.